mid-'80s, I worked for a bank, and I was in charge of a department that had enough people in it that I could have an administrative assistant. Her name was Lorna, and she had just immigrated from the Philippines and was studying for her U.S. citizenship test. So, being the extremely helpful department that we were, we decided that we should quiz her on her test questions. But not just that. We decided that she should learn essential American idioms, like up a creek without a paddle, and between a rock and a hard place. One day, the entire staff was summoned to a meeting, and so as I left the floor, I called out to Lorna, "Hold down the fort." Well, later I was returning my messages, and one of my colleagues said, "What did you tell Lorna when you left for that meeting?" I said, "Well, we're working on Hold Down the Fort." And he said, "Oh, well, that makes sense then, because she told me you told her to hold up the porch." So how Lorna had interpreted that saying has stayed with me for over 30 years, because I thought it was a much more beautiful way of thinking. She got the idea, be supportive, be responsible, be in charge, take charge, all of that. But her view of what that could look like was transformational. She took the "you have heard that it was said, hold down the fort," and turned it into "but I say to you, hold up the porch." So I want to take a few minutes just to compare and contrast Lorna's take on that. And it will actually go very well with Jesus and Buddha's invitations to consider fresh perspectives, new ways of thinking and speaking and acting. You have heard it said, hold down. Well, the best image I have of holding something down is a cat when you are trying to hydrate it. So one of my jobs when I lived in Portland, Oregon, was to house sit for a friend, and she had this beautiful black cat named Parker. But toward the end of his life, he developed the feline kidney disease, and so he had to be hydrated with a saline solution every couple of days. And this is what it looked like. First of all, fish Parker out from underneath the dresser or the bed in the furthest corner, which took a little bit of time in and of itself. Bring him to the kitchen where I had set up the saline solution hanging from a cabinet door, and pin him down. So, this is the cat. I have the cat this way. I've got the syringe this way. I've flicked it open. I've squirted the air out of it. And I have stuck it in his neck. And I've had to hold it there for 3 to 5 minutes. So, not a pretty sight. My shoulders are hunched. I'm looking down. You know, my arms are rigid, all of that kind of thing. And he is not happy. And I look awful, and I'm not even the one getting the spike shoved in my neck. But change that a little bit. I say to you, hold up. What if I could have cradled Parker in my arms? What if I could have held him up during this procedure? My shoulders are back, and I'm not saying it's easier to hold something up than hold something down, but I do think we have more resources. Your shoulders are back, you can breathe better, you have a horizon to look at, and you can invite people in rather than shoulder them out. So eventually, I got the bright idea to invite a friend to help me. And during the entire procedure, I cradled Parker in my arms, and I was comforting him during this entire procedure, and it was amazing the difference. He did not struggle, and we were happy. Of course, somebody else was holding the needle. I do need to mention that. The night before Parker died, he crawled onto my chest, and he put one paw on either side of my neck, and he put his cheek on my cheek, and he was saying, "Thank you for changing the way that you cared for me. and I love you too. What in our lives do we tend to hold down or suppress rather than hold or lift up? Do we hold down our emotions, our joy, our love? And where in the world do we restrict rather than liberate? Our neighborhoods, our schools, our borders? You have heard that it was said, hold down the fort. Well, when I hear the word fort, I'm transported to the Old West, and I have a picture of these big wooden poles carved to spiky points at one end. And as a kid, I always wondered if they just had this great big giant pencil sharpener so that they could get those poles. And they were strapped together, and they were designed to keep the other out. In these walls were just small openings for the barrel of a gun. And on each of the corners was a watchtower that had a cannon in it. And the people inside the fort had very little landscape to look at. And the people who were approaching the fort were approaching a hostile welcome. They are reminiscent of other walls in our history. I have to Google these things. So the oldest defensive wall is said to have been built about 7825 BCE, before the Common Era. But the biblical wall of Jericho dates anywhere from 1950 to 1550 BCE, and you know what happened to that wall? It came tumbling down. The Amorite wall was a massive fortified barrier built by the Sumerians to keep out the Amorites, a group of nomadic tribesmen. It was thought to have stretched over 100 miles in what is now Iraq, but it was actually not very effective. People either went through it or around it. The long walls of Athens stood until Athens' defeat at sea in the Peloponnesian War with Sparta. And legend has it that those hated long walls were demolished to the sound of celebratory music from flute girls. The Great Wall of China, in some places built of bricks and a mortar made of slaked lime and sticky rice, was often ineffective, despite its meandering over 1,000 miles from the Gobi Desert to the North Korean border. The infamous Berlin Wall, although advertised as a way to keep fascists and other enemies of the state out, was built primarily to prevent the East Germans from defecting to the West. But there are thousands of stories of people permeating the wall or tunneling under the wall, or, and I love this part, flying over the wall in ultralight aircraft or homemade hot air balloons. And when it was opened and eventually demolished, there were celebrations and a reunification. Our modern day walls include the West Bank Barrier. Currently, it runs over 400 miles, and in some cases, it measures 330 feet in width and over 26 feet high. The Israeli government states that the wall is being built to prevent attacks on the Israeli citizens from suicide bombers and radical terrorist groups. And the Palestinian groups call it a social segregation and apartheid wall. The political debates are heated, but when we move to the human condition, we see over and over how walls separate families, and in the case of this particular wall, separate people from basic medical treatment. Critically ill Palestinians have had to travel over 60 kilometers to a hospital in Ramallah, rather than to the Israeli hospital, which was 5 minutes away. In our own country, we come full circle to Wild West forts again at our southern border. The subject of controversy, the cause of violence, and a tangible evidence of holding down. I have never been in favor of walls, but my aversion became palpable in November of 2017 when I was visiting Las Playas de Tijuana, It's right at the northern tip of Mexico, and so it's bordered by the Pacific Ocean on the west and California on the north. And the existing wall just runs into the sea at that point. But there is kind of a nomad zone between the Mexican wall and the United States barrier where people come from the United States. They can't cross over the border for some reason to visit relatives and friends, but they can come to the wall there. Well, the morning I was there, this neutral zone was filling with people, and there was a woman on the Mexican side who brought her chair, and she sat down by the wall to wait. And in 15, 20 minutes, a man walked toward her through the neutral zone and stood before her, and she stood up, and they hugged in between these bars and tried to kiss. So just imagine for a moment if you were separated from your loved one by a bar that was on your cheek. I just hope that there will be a time when such walls can be demolished to the celebratory music of flute girls. But I say to you, hold up the porch. When I was a kid, I spent most of my summers on our front porch. It was the width of the house, and on one end was a swing that was suspended from the ceiling, and on the other end was various porch furniture, a glider and a chaise lounge and some folding chairs. The entire porch was screened, which in Indiana is really necessary because the mosquitoes are as big as dragonflies. And the summer breezes would blow through that porch as I read hour upon hour in that swing. Often in the evenings, the neighbors would be out sitting on their porches, and we had a very narrow tree-lined street, and they would call across the street to each other, "How are you doing?" Or they would be walking the neighborhoods. We had a bug light that was yellow, and so our whole porch kind of glowed with this beautiful golden haze. And Mary or Lucille, our across-the-street neighbors, would come by and come up and drink lemonade with us. This porch was inviting. It was welcoming. It was a sanctuary, in a way, for the neighborhood. It was rarely quiet, but it was never frantic. It was filled with the conversation of human connection or the silence of cricket song. I loved that porch. And I love that Lorna, in her wisdom, replaced the images of suppression and defensiveness with those of support and receiving. You have heard that it was said, "Hold down the fort." But I say to you, hold up the porch. Jesus' counsel is similar. Take an old adage and transform it. You have heard that it was said, "An eye for an eye." But I say to you, be kind to an evildoer. Give both your coat and your cloak. Go further than is asked and share your resources. You have heard that it was said, "Hate your enemies." But I say to you, love your enemies. Try to understand them and pray for them. And the Buddha says, abandon revenge and do not retaliate in the same manner that you have been treated. Overcome anger by love, evil by good, the miser by giving, the liar by truth. As I was preparing for today, I asked a friend to read my narrative, and her primary question was, Marge, where's the how-to? How do we get to that place of love versus hate? Good versus evil? Peace versus violence? My answer is, I can't answer that. Each person must travel an individual journey to such a conclusion. And what that path looks like is a function of one's own experience and character. And the journey includes false steps, wrong turns, learning, beginning again. I believe one must approach one's own truth before it is possible to make room for another person's truth. I also believe any change first takes self-awareness, a conscious noticing of our thoughts, our words, our habits, our ruts, our darkness, and our light before we can consider a new direction. But along with awareness, it helps to be confronted with an inspiration or a challenge to push us to step into a different path or open us to a new horizon. John O'Donohue begins his poem with the reflection, "In out-of-the-way places of the heart, where our thoughts never think to wander, we are often unable to leave what we have outgrown. You have heard that it was said, stay in the safety of the known, no matter how uncomfortable it is, if you will." But he continues with "But I say to you, unfurl yourself into the grace of beginning, awaken your spirit, learn to find ease in risk. Notice the delight when your courage kindled and out you stepped into new ground, your eyes young again with energy and dream." Pushing such an awareness into my consciousness happened when Lorna transformed that simple idiom for me. And since then, I have revisioned other sayings. You have heard that it was said, kill 2 birds with 1 stone. I say to you, feed 2 birds from an outstretched hand. You have heard it said, there's more than one way to skin a cat. I say to you, there's more than one way to hydrate a cat. And changing one's outlook can happen over time, as courage gradually takes hold and the new beginning gathers strength. Thich Nhat Hanh writes, our notions about happiness, or you fill in the blank, entrap us. We forget that they are just ideas. Our idea of happiness can prevent us from actually being happy. We fail to see the opportunity for joy that is right in front of us when we are caught in a belief that happiness should take a particular form. Aware of our biases, of our tendencies sometimes to stay in circumstances that we have outgrown, playing with the seduction of safety and sameness, we can begin to recognize a path of plenitude opening before us. And we can trust the promise of this opening because it is one with our heart's desire. You have heard that it was said, hold down the fort. But I say to you, hold up the porch. Amen.